Hello everyone to this lab demonstration video where we're looking at the anatomical model of the pelvis along with the lower portion of the vertebral column here. So before we go into the individual bones and what they're called, let me just give you a quick three-dimensional look into what the pelvis looks like. So we're looking at the frontal view here. Let's move ourselves to the lateral view, to the sides, where you can see there are a lot of individual bones. We'll talk about the joint here with the femur in more detail. Going to the posterior portion, this is where you have the vertebral column that connects the two halves of the pelvis. We'll talk about the sacral portion right here in the coccyx or the tailbone. And then of course symmetrically on the other side of the lateral, you have the individual bones as well. We'll talk about what they are. So coming back to the front, let's talk about the major bones that make up the pelvis, or what's called the pelvic girdle itself. The largest portion of the pelvis itself is made up by this bone right here. This is called the ilium. And one of these sort of landmarks, or easy way to highlight this guy, is this structure right here. This is where we typically rest our hands when we put our hands on the hips. This is called the iliac crest. And then when we work our way further down to the pelvic girdle, on the front over here, we have the ischium. This is going further down to this little turning structure right here called the ischial tuberosity. This is what's also more commonly called the sitting bones. So when we're sitting on a chair, this is what we're resting our pelvis on right here, the sylvian bone. And then working our way to the back here, so we have the ilium, we have the ischium, and then on the all right, so looking at the side here, we have the ilium, we have the ischium with the sitting bones, ischial tuberosity as we mentioned, and then going to the front, we have the pubis bone. Now, this joint that you see here where you have the meeting of the three bones coming together labeled as G, this is called the acetabulum. This is what makes up one of the halves of the ball and socket joint with our femur. So our femur in this case would be connected right here, allowing it to have that range of motion. We talked about this in another video talking about the leg. So this is where you'll have the femur connecting with the pelvis itself, and this portion here made up of the three bones labeled G is called the acetabulum. This is again what's allowing that ball and socket joint to form together and provides a various range of motion. Working our way to the front, we have this little cartilage structure right here. This is called the pubis symphysis. This is again allowing some flexibility to your hips itself, but if we work ourselves to the back, you have this little hole right here. This is where you'll find various organs housed. So immediately posterior to this cartilage structure is typically where you'll find the bladder. This is where urine is stored as part of the urinary system. And for the female reproductive system, this is also where we will find the uterus as well. Now, when it comes to the length of the hips themselves, or the width in this case, when it comes to male and females, males in this case typically have a little more narrower of the pelvic girdle itself, versus females usually have a slightly wider one. This is what's one of the developments as part of puberty. This is again just to get part of that sort of reproductive sexual maturity where their body is getting ready for the fact that eventually, if they're going to be giving birth to a baby, they need to have enough space here for the uterus to grow and eventually for the baby to come out through the birth canal itself on the other side. Some other structures I want to highlight is on the posterior portion here. This is the lower portion of the vertebral column. So we're working our way down the individual vertebra where you get to the last portion, what's highlighted here, D. This is the sacrum, and on the bottom here you have the coccyx. The way you can highlight these guys or easily spot them is the fact that unlike your other portion of the vertebral column where the individual vertebrae can be easily highlighted and you can see the vertebral discs separating them, when it comes to the sacral and the coccyx and the adult stage, they typically fuse together. And again, I can show you from the back here. You can see that they're pretty much fused into a single bone, especially when it comes to the later portion of our age. So they initially start out separated, but over time they fuse together. Very different from the architecture of the remaining portion of the vertebral column. Other than that, that is the end of the video. One last thing to mention, apologize for that, and that is this hole right here, right in front or anterior to the acetabulum. This is the orbital foramen. This is where you have many of the blood vessels and nerves coming down from the vertebral column, from the abdominal portion itself, making sure that they're protected. So because our hips and the legs, we sit on these, there's lots of movement going on here. So you want to make sure that they don't get damaged. So they have a little cavity here, kind of have a protected root as they're coming down to the remaining portion of the lower body.